This is the iPhone 14 Pro Max, the highest tier offering in the new iPhone lineup. Like last year, the Pro Max provides the same premium features as the Pro model, but it's larger and has a bigger battery. So does that mean that this is the best iPhone yet? I'm Will for GSM Arena, and let's find out in our iPhone 14 Pro Max review. Apple has split up the iPhones in a similar fashion to last year. The iPhone 14 is a compact model with slimmed-down features. The Pro is the same size, but with the premium feature set. And on top is the Pro Max, which doesn't offer more features, but its bigger form factor allows for extra screen space, as well as a larger battery. There are a few changes this year compared to last year's Pro Max. The most noticeable is on the front. The notch cutout has turned into a pill-shaped one, and it has some extra functionality built in. There's now also support for an always-on display for the first time on the iPhones. It's basically the lock screen with a dim brightness level and toned-down refresh rate to save energy. Besides that, the Pro Max has an upgraded chipset, a new 48-megapixel main camera on the back, and the selfie camera has autofocus this year too. The rest of the package, including the design, is quite a familiar one, except for our model's new purple color. The hefty build of flat glass and stainless steel is the same as before. The slight difference you may notice is that the camera bumps are a little bigger and taller to house the new main cam, but the phone's overall weight is still identical, down to the gram. The iPhone 14 Pro Max, of course, brings the full IP68 rated protection against dust and water, up to a depth of 6 meters. Just like last year's model, the phone is built around a 6.7-inch Super Retina XDR OLED display. It has a pixel density of 460 ppi, ceramic shield protection, and a 120Hz refresh rate. That fast refresh rate made its debut last year, and it hasn't changed here. It smooths out your swiping and scrolling, and can dial down to save energy, all the way to 10Hz while the screen is on, and now 1Hz for the always-on display. What has changed is the brightness. It's a pretty nice upgrade. We were able to measure a maximum of 830 nits with the manual brightness slider, but this can boost to 1760 nits in auto mode when in bright sun, beating any of the competition by a long shot. The most hyped new feature on this display though is the pill cutout, which Apple calls the dynamic island. At first glance, it's just a black cutout housing the selfie cam and Face ID, but it's also integrated with the UI, extending on the left and right sides when you open a compatible app, like a music app, and displaying relevant info. It can also show system alerts, like charging for example. The dynamic island generally works for one thing at a time, but in some cases a second app is supported, and when you open that up, it will split the dynamic island into an eye shape. Tapping and holding on the dynamic island's icons will open them up into a larger balloon window, or a simple tap will directly open up the respective app. Overall, it's slightly gimmicky, but at the same time kind of neat. And while the dynamic island is still in its early stages, it will have support for even more functionality down the line. Although the cutout is new, it's not exactly smaller. It sits a little lower, so it takes up a bit more screen space. But that's not as big of an issue here as it is on the Pro model, as this screen has extra space to work with. Besides that, content is sharp, vibrant, and contrasty, and the color accuracy is excellent. And there's support for HDR10 and Dolby Vision as well. For audio, the iPhone 14 Pro Max has a pair of stereo speakers, with the earpiece acting as the top one. They earned a score of very good in our loudness test, and the sound quality is excellent, with clean vocals, sparkly treble, and pronounced low end. Of course, storage isn't expandable on the iPhones, but you have plenty of storage options, from 128 gigs all the way up to a whole terabyte. And the interface of the new iPhone generation is the new iOS 16. It's not a groundbreaking update, but there are a few new features here and there. One of the more notable changes is the lock screen, which is now also the always-on display. Swiping up will access your notifications. The screen is also customizable with widgets and wallpapers. And you can have a number of custom layouts that you can switch between on the fly. The lock screen layouts can also be linked to your focus modes, so if you're in Do Not Disturb, for example, you could know just by the appearance of your always-on display. The focus modes also have the ability to link to your mail and messaging apps, to filter your messages and emails right from the source. Plenty of apps have seen upgrades with iOS 16, including FaceTime and the Wallet app. Visual lookup isn't quite new, but it has been improved a lot. One thing it can do is isolate an object from a photo or video by tapping and holding on it. Then you can copy and paste it, save it for later, or even drag it straight into an editor or a messaging app. And there's an emergency SOS feature, which provides several ways to request aid if you're in trouble. In some regions, you can even send an SOS through satellite, handy if you have no network coverage. Powering the iPhone 14 Pro Max is a new chipset, the Apple A16 Bionic, which is also found within the iPhone 14 Pro. It contains more power-efficient CPU cores, as well as more memory bandwidth for the GPU. There are also upgrades in the Neural Engine and the ISP for photography, and now there's a new display engine too. In benchmarks, there is a noticeable improvement over last year's A15 Bionic when it comes to CPU scores, and the iPhone 14 Pro Max tops the charts. The GPU performance is about on par with what we've seen before. Even so, that's still excellent. And when it comes to thermal management, the iPhone 14 Pro Max does a remarkable job. The phone displayed great stability during our stress tests. The iPhone 14 Pro Max has a 4,323 mAh battery, basically the same size as last year. The battery life is very similar too. While the screen on time is a bit better, the new model earned the same great endurance rating of 121 hours in our tests. That's some of the best battery life you can get on an iPhone. New iPhones don't come with a charger in the box, but we tested the charging speed using Apple's 20-watt adapter. With it, we were able to charge the iPhone 14 Pro Max from 0 to 48% in half an hour. Nothing too remarkable. There's also support for wireless charging. The cameras of the iPhone 14 Pro Max are the same as the Pro model. There's a new 48-megapixel main cam with a quad-Bayer filter, and it has second-gen sensor shift stabilization and full focus pixels. Besides that, there's a 12-megapixel ultra-wide cam which has a new sensor and lens, and like last year, it has autofocus. Then there's the 12-megapixel 3x telephoto and a LiDAR scanner for portraits and focus. Since the main cam has a quad-Bayer filter, it bins pixels 4:1 to produce 12-megapixel photos by default. These photos are pretty much the same as what we've seen from the iPhones over the past couple of years. There's plenty of detail, low noise, accurate colors, and excellent contrast. The dynamic range is reasonable without going over the top. Our only real complaint is the foliage rendition. It's heavily processed and anything but natural looking. You also can shoot in the main cam's full 48 megapixels in RAW format. And compared to the full resolution modes of other phones with quad-Bayer cameras, this one is probably the best we've seen. If you take one of those 48 megapixel photos and downsize it back to 12, the results are class-leading. They're impressively detailed, with natural-looking rendition. Noise is nowhere to be found, colors are wonderful, and contrast and dynamic range are on point. Too bad you need to jump through hoops to get there. The iPhone 14 Pro Max can provide 2x lossless zoom by cropping from the 48 megapixel image. These shots look great, with an excellent amount of detail, even better than some dedicated telephotos. When taking portraits, the phone defaults to the 2x zoom, and the results are great. The subjects look sharp and well defined. Plus the separation is proficient, and the blurred backgrounds look natural. You also have the option to take portraits with the main cam at 1x zoom, or with the telephoto cam at 3x zoom, for a different perspective. The telephoto's 3x zoomed images don't disappoint. They are detailed and sharp, with a natural look and likable rendition. The colors are accurate, the contrast is high, and the dynamic range is wide enough. Now on to the ultra-wide. Its photos are some of the best you can get from this sort of camera. There's plenty of detail, proficient distortion correction, and good sharpness throughout the frame, even at the corners. Plus the color reproduction, contrast, and dynamic range are a solid match for the other cameras. Since the ultra-wide has autofocus, you can use it to take close-up shots from as close as 4 centimeters. These are good, with nice detail and colors and low noise. In low light conditions, Apple's night mode will kick in automatically. The photos from the main cam are great. There's plenty of detail and low noise. The exposure is just a touch brighter than reality, and you get well-contained highlights as well as moderately brightened shadows. You can toggle the night mode off, and the resulting photos are darker, with more noise in dark areas. When the night mode is working, 3x zoom shots will come from the telephoto cam. The photos offer impressive detail, natural-looking sharpness, and low noise. There's plenty of contrast, and the colors look great. If the night mode is toggled off or doesn't kick in, at this level of zoom you may get a crop from the main cam depending on the level of light. Regardless of the camera, the results have a darker exposure but are still good. The ultra-wide camera takes nice low-light photos with the help of night mode. The images have good exposure, contrast, and dynamic range. And there's a decent amount of detail depending on how well lit the scene is. Without night mode, the photos are underexposed and noisier with less saturated colors, but they're still usable. This year, Apple has brought OIS and autofocus to the front-facing camera. The 12-megapixel selfies are great, the autofocus works well, and photos are nicely detailed with well-contained noise, wide dynamic range, and accurate colors. Facial features are enhanced a bit too much though, which may come through as unflattering. The iPhone 14 Pro Max can record 4K video in up to 60 FPS with the selfie cam and all 3 rear cameras. And all modes feature expanded dynamic range too through Smart HDR. The main camera shoots superb 4K videos with a ton of resolved detail and natural rendition without any over-sharpening. The colors are lively, there is no noise, and the dynamic range is great, and so is the contrast. The telephoto camera puts out a respectable performance. The colors and contrast are a solid match for the main camera, and detail is very good as well. The 4K footage from the ultra-wide camera is excellent. It's detailed and noise-free, and the clips have spot-on colors and a wide dynamic range. The electronic stabilization is always on, and it's as good as ever. There is a new mode called Enhanced Stabilization, which crops more and is supposed to be smoother, but we didn't see much difference there. And there's another one called Action Mode. It crops heavily from the 4K footage to produce video that's super smooth, at the expense of some field of view and resolution. Low-light 4K video from the main camera is great, with low noise and plenty of resolved detail, rendered in a reasonably natural way. Exposure and dynamic range are good too. The 3x zoomed nighttime photos are usable, but far from great, as they're often crops from the main camera. They have likable colors and contrast, but they're soft. Low-light video from the ultra-wide camera is quite solid. Sharpness is good, as is resolved detail, especially in better lit areas. The color saturation is excellent, and the dynamic range is good too. So that's the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Apple hasn't made a whole lot of changes here, but we do enjoy the brighter screen, the 2x lossless zoom, and the autofocus on the selfie cam. And while the dynamic island might be a bit gimmicky, it's still something unique. In the end, the iPhone 14 Pro Max is only a little bit better than the previous model, and the difference probably isn't enough to be worth an upgrade. But that still means it's technically the latest and greatest iPhone, and to a lot of people, that's worth something. Thanks for watching guys, and see you on the next one.